Then you'd better open the black envelope beside his coffin. Because Dad knew exactly what you did.
The young widow standing beside my father's coffin believed she had already won. She had his mansion, his money, and a signed will that left my brother and me almost nothing. Then the funeral director walked toward her with a sealed black envelope, and the smile vanished from her face. Hello. My name is Diane Mercer, and I was 34 years old when my family learned how dangerous loneliness could be. My father, Richard Mercer, had always been the strongest person I knew. He built a successful construction company in Ohio from one borrowed truck and a toolbox. By the time my brother Daniel and I were adults, Mercer and Sons employed more than 200 people. Dad owned a beautiful house outside Columbus, several rental properties, and enough investments to live comfortably for the rest of his life. But none of that mattered after my mother died. Mom and Dad had been married for 41 years. Her death from cancer left him moving through the house like a man searching for a room that no longer existed. He stopped attending Sunday dinners. He let Mom's garden turn brown. Sometimes he called me late at night just to ask whether I remembered the way she laughed. Daniel and I tried everything. We invited him on trips, encouraged him to join a grief group, and visited whenever we could. Still, grief had settled inside him. Then, 14 months after Mom's death, Dad called and said he had met someone. Her name was Vanessa Cole. She was 32, 2 years younger than me and 36 years younger than Dad. I met her at a restaurant the following Saturday. She arrived 20 minutes late in a white sports car, wearing a red dress and a diamond bracelet I immediately recognized. It had belonged to my mother. Dad stood when Vanessa approached. His face lit up in a way I had not seen since Mom became sick. "Diane," he said, "this is the woman who taught me how to feel alive again." Vanessa hugged before I could offer my hand. "I've heard so much about you," she said. "Richard says you're very protective." It sounded like a compliment, but her eyes told me it was a warning. During dinner, she spoke constantly about the countries she wanted to visit, the charity foundation she wanted Dad to finance, and the renovations the house desperately needed. Dad laughed at every joke and paid no attention when she ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu. I tried to be fair. Dad was lonely, and Vanessa made him happy. Perhaps the age difference looked worse than it was. Perhaps my discomfort came from seeing another woman wear Mom's jewelry. Then Vanessa excused herself to answer a phone call. As she walked away, a folded receipt fell from her purse. I picked it up. It was from a luxury jewelry store. The purchase was for $68,000, charged to my father's account 3 days earlier. Dad took the receipt from me and folded it carefully. "It was a gift?" he said. "You've known her for 6 weeks." His face hardened. "I don't need my daughter's permission to spend my own money." That was the first time Vanessa placed a wall between us. It would not be the last. 2 months later, Dad announced their engagement. Daniel nearly dropped his coffee. We asked Dad to sign a prenuptial agreement. We explained that no one was trying to control him. We simply wanted to protect the company, the longtime employees, and the assets he had built with Mom. Vanessa cried before Dad could answer. "I knew this would happen," she whispered. "Your children think I'm a gold digger." Dad put his arm around her. Then he looked at us with a cold expression I barely recognized. "There will be no prenup," he said. "And if you cannot respect my future wife, you should not attend the wedding." We attended because we loved him. The ceremony took place at a private vineyard. Vanessa wore a dress that cost more than my first house. Her relatives filled the front rows while Daniel and I were seated behind people we had never met. During the reception, I went inside looking for Dad. I heard voices coming from a small office near the kitchen. Vanessa was speaking to a man. "Once the documents are updated, the children can complain all they want," she said. "Richard signs anything I put in front of him." I pushed the door open. Vanessa stood beside a tall man in a gray suit. She introduced him as Aaron Blake, an old family friend who worked in financial planning. "What documents?" I asked. She smiled. "Travel insurance. Richard and I are going to Italy." The answer came too quickly. When I told Dad what I had heard, he accused me of spying on his wife during her wedding. Vanessa did not speak. She only watched me from behind his shoulder with the faintest smile. Within 6 months, everything changed. Dad removed Daniel from the company board. He transferred 2 rental properties to a new limited company controlled by Vanessa. He replaced his longtime attorney, Martin Hale, with a lawyer recommended by Aaron. Then he stopped taking my calls. Whenever I reached him, Vanessa was nearby. "Your father is resting. Richard doesn't need stress. We're traveling this weekend." She spoke as though Dad had become a private property she had purchased. The real shock came at Thanksgiving. Daniel and I arrived at Dad's house carrying food. The locks had been changed. A security guard met us at the gate and handed me an envelope. Inside was a typed letter saying Dad needed distance from our hostility. At the bottom was his signature, but it looked shaky and uneven. I called him. Vanessa answered. "But doesn't want to see you," she said. In the background, I heard Dad coughing. Put him on the phone. Go home, Diane. Then she hung up. That night I made a decision. If Dad truly wanted me gone, I would accept it. But first I needed to know that those were his wishes. I hired a private investigator named Elena Ruiz. Elena was a former insurance fraud examiner with a calm voice and an extraordinary ability to find details people thought they had buried. I gave her Vanessa's full name, Aaron's name, and copies of every public business filing I could locate. 4 days later, Elena called me. Vanessa Cole is not her original name, she said. Her legal name had been Vanessa Crawford. 7 years earlier, she had married a wealthy 71-year-old real estate investor named Harold Price in Arizona. Harold died less than a year later after falling down a staircase. Vanessa inherited nearly $2 million. No charges were filed. The death was ruled accidental. 2 years after that, became engaged to a retired surgeon in Florida. The engagement ended when the surgeon's daughter discovered Vanessa had used his credit to transfer more than $300,000 into an investment account. Vanessa repaid part of it through a private settlement. And Aaron Blake was not just an old friend. He was Vanessa's half-brother. I felt physically sick. Elena warned me that suspicious history was not proof of a current crime. We needed records, witnesses, or a statement from Dad. But Vanessa controlled the house, his telephone, his appointments, and almost everyone around him. Almost everyone. Dad's housekeeper, Rosa, had worked for our family for 18 years. I found her leaving a grocery store and asked if we could talk. She began crying before I finished my first question. Rosa said Dad had become weak and confused. Vanessa had replaced his regular doctor with a private physician named Dr. Paul Kent. Dad took several new medications that made him sleep for hours. On his clear days, he asked about Daniel and me. Vanessa told him we were too busy to visit. Then Rosa gave me a small voice recorder. "Your father asked me to hide this," she said. "He told me that if anything happened to him, I must give it to you." My hands shook as I pressed play. Dad's voice was quiet but clear. "Diane, if you are hearing this, I finally understood what Vanessa was doing. I was ashamed to admit that you were right. I signed documents while heavily medicated. I don't know everything she changed. I am trying to fix it. Please do not confront her. Speak to Martin." Martin Hale, the attorney Dad had supposedly fired. I drove to Martin's office that afternoon. He locked the door after I entered and closed the blinds. Dad had contacted him secretly 3 weeks earlier. He believed Vanessa and Aaron were draining his accounts. More than $4 million had already moved through shell companies. Dad wanted to reverse the transfers and restore his original estate plan. But he had also discovered something worse. Dr. Kent had prescribed him a combination of sedatives at unusually high doses. Dad suspected Vanessa was crushing additional pills into his evening drinks. He had saved a sample and asked Martin to arrange private testing. The laboratory found a powerful sedative that was not listed on Dad's prescription chart. Martin had advised him to leave immediately and report everything to the police. Dad refused. He wanted undeniable proof, Martin said. He feared that if he acted too early, Vanessa would destroy the evidence and claim he was confused. So, Dad made a plan. He created a new trust beyond Vanessa's control. He restored Daniel and me as equal beneficiaries, protected the company shares for its employees, and revoked every power of attorney naming Vanessa or Aaron. The mansion would not go to her either. After Dad's death, it would be sold, and the proceeds would fund a cancer care center named after my mother. Vanessa did not know. Dad wanted her to believe the old will was still valid while Martin collected evidence. There was one final part of the plan. Dad had recorded conversations in his study using a hidden security system. Martin would deliver those recordings to investigators when Dad was safely out of the house. We arranged to move him the next morning. We were too late. At 4:17 a.m. Vanessa called me. "Your father is dead," she said. There was no grief in her voice, only irritation. She claimed she had found him unconscious in bed. Dr. Kent signed a preliminary statement suggesting natural cardiac failure. Vanessa wanted immediate cremation, just as Dad had supposedly requested. I told her not to touch his body. Then I called the police, Martin and Elena. The county medical examiner ordered an autopsy after hearing about the unlisted sedative. Vanessa was furious. She accused me of turning Dad's death into a circus because I could not accept being removed from his will. For the next 10 days, the house became a crime scene. Investigators found missing medication logs, shredded bank statements, and a locked case containing prescription bottles with other patients' names. They also recovered the hidden recordings from Dad's study. One recording captured Vanessa speaking with Aaron. "After the funeral, we liquidate everything," she said. "The old man won't be a problem much longer. Another captured Dr. Kent warning her that Dad's blood pressure was dangerously low. Vanessa answered, then reduce the evidence, not the dose. The autopsy found levels of 2 sedatives far beyond the therapeutic range. The medical examiner changed the manner of death from natural to undetermined, while detectives continued investigating. Martin told us to remain silent. He wanted Vanessa to keep believing she controlled the estate. That was why the funeral proceeded. Vanessa planned it like a performance. She chose a gold-trimmed coffin, hundreds of white roses, and a black designer dress. She invited local business leaders and made sure photographers saw her arriving in Dad's most expensive car. Daniel sat beside me in the second row. Our grief was real, but we also knew something was coming. Vanessa stood beside the coffin greeting guests as though she were hosting a charity gala. I heard her tell one woman that she planned to sell the company because managing it would be too emotionally painful. Then the funeral director approached her, carrying a sealed black envelope. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "your husband left instructions that this be delivered to you before the service begins." Vanessa smiled and tore it open. I watched the color disappear from her face. The letter informed her that Dad's final legal estate plan had revoked the earlier will. She would receive only the amount required under their marriage agreement. A marriage agreement Dad had convinced her to sign quietly during a tax planning meeting months earlier. It provided her with $100,000, but only if she had not committed financial fraud, elder abuse, or contributed to his death. Because those issues were under criminal investigation, every payment was frozen. Vanessa crushed the letter in her fist and marched toward Martin. "This is fake," she hissed. Martin did not raise his voice. The documents were signed while Richard was evaluated by 2 independent physicians and recorded on video. "They are legal." The chapel had become completely silent. Vanessa turned toward me. "You did this." "No," I said. "Dad did." She took one step in my direction, but 2 detectives entered through the rear doors. They were not there to arrest her for murder. Not yet. They had warrants for financial exploitation, identity theft, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. Aaron had been arrested that morning while attempting to board a flight to Mexico. Dr. Kent was taken into custody at his office. When the detectives reached Vanessa, she tried to regain control. "My husband is lying right there," she cried. "Have you no respect?" One detective looked at the coffin, then back at her. "That is exactly why we're here." As they placed her in handcuffs, a small object fell from her purse and rolled across the chapel floor. It was my mother's diamond bracelet. I picked it up. For the first time since this nightmare began, Vanessa looked afraid, not because she had lost Dad, but because she had lost everything she believed his death would give her. The investigation lasted almost a year. Bank records proved Vanessa and Aaron had forged Dad's signatures and moved millions of dollars through false consulting companies. Security footage showed Vanessa entering Dad's room with medication on the night he died. Messages from Dr. Kent explained how to hide the extra sedatives inside a protein drink. Faced with the evidence, Aaron accepted a deal and testified against Vanessa and Dr. Kent. Vanessa was convicted of financial exploitation, conspiracy, fraud, evidence tampering, and second-degree murder. She received a sentence that ensured she would be an old woman before she could even request parole. Dr. Kent lost his medical license and was sent to prison. Most of the stolen money was recovered. But justice did not bring Dad back. That was the hardest truth. For months, I blamed myself. I replayed every conversation and wondered whether I should have acted sooner, shouted louder, or forced my way through that locked gate on Thanksgiving. Then Martin gave me one final recording Dad had made. His voice sounded stronger than it had on the first one. "Diane," he said, "you will probably think you failed me. You didn't. I failed myself when pride became more important than listening to the people who loved me. Vanessa used my loneliness, but I gave her power because I was afraid to admit I had made a mistake. Do not carry my shame. Build something good from what remains." So we did. The mansion was sold. The Rose Mercer Cancer Support Center opened 18 months later on land donated by the company. It offers transportation, counseling, meals, and home care support to families facing the same disease that took my mother. Daniel became chairman of Mercer & Sons. The employees received shares through the trust Dad created. Rosa became the first guest of honor at the center's opening ceremony. I wore Mom's bracelet that day. After the ceremony, I stood beneath a photograph of my parents taken on their 30th anniversary. They were laughing, their hands linked together, still unaware of the grief and betrayal waiting years ahead. I no longer remember Dad only as the vulnerable man Vanessa manipulated. I remember the father who taught me to ride a bicycle, the builder who knew every employee's name, and the grieving husband who eventually found enough courage to expose the truth. Vanessa believed youth made her powerful. She believed money made Dad weak, and death would make her untouchable. But she misunderstood one thing: a stolen signature can move money, yet it can never replace trust. At my father's funeral, she finally received exactly what she had earned. Not his fortune, not his home, and not his name, but the consequences of every choice she thought no one would ever discover. And that is the lesson my father left me: greed may enter a family wearing a beautiful smile, but when the truth finally opens the door, justice never forgets who came to steal.